Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computation, such as training machine learning models and running your continuous integration, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode, today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Dataversity, Corinium Global Intelligence, and Data Council. Upcoming events include the O'Reilly AI Conference, the Strata Data Conference, the combined events of the Data Architecture Summit and Graph Forum, and Data Council in Barcelona. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences today to learn more about these and other events, and take advantage of our partner discounts when you register. Your host as usual is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Saul Pwanson about Visidata, a terminal-oriented interactive multitool for tabular data. So Saul, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Saul, and I've been working in the software industry for a while, and I live in Seattle.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, it was for work back in 2004, so Python 2 days. I was at a startup, and they were using it for their apps, and I picked it up because that's what you do, right?
And so at some point you decided that you needed to start building your own multi-tool for working with data, particularly in tabular formats. And I'm wondering if you can just start by describing a bit about the tool that you built in the form of Visidata and some of the backstory of how it got started.
Yeah, so I was working at a company called F5 Networks in 2011, I think, and I built a early prototype of Visidata for them, basically. I didn't know it at the time. It was just a configuration and kind of exploration tool for their own networking hardware. But as I got to using it, I found the concept very flexible, and I kept adding more and more stuff to it. And then after I left F5, I found myself missing it. I kept wanting to use it to just look at like HDF5 files or just random tabular data that I had. And so when I was at another company in 2016, and that company was winding down, I was turning 40, and I looked back over my career of almost 20 years and realized that I didn't have very much to show for it. And I was like, well, I've been wanting this tool just kind of around and about, so let me just start that again. I couldn't use the code that I'd written at F5, obviously, so I was like, well, if I'm going to rewrite it, let me do it again from scratch, and I'll do it right once and for all, like the tool that I want to use. And so that's the genesis of Visidata.
There are a couple interesting things in there. One, the fact that you had to try and rewrite this tool from scratch, largely from memory, without copying the exact code that you had written. And then also, you mentioned HDF5 files, and I'm curious if you had experimented with PyTables at all or any of the other libraries for that particular data format, and what you found lacking that you wanted to have present in Visidata.
Yeah, so I hadn't used PyTables, but I've used a lot of other Python tools for using HDF5 files. And just like with any complicated format, you can do anything you want to with Python. Python's really great for that, but it's still kind of a hassle. You still have to write code to do it. And often what I would want to do is just open up an HDF5 file and take a quick check and see if that data, for instance, isn't all zeros or has the tables that I want in there. And the tools that I had, there was one that was written in Java. And so, of course, you'd start it up and it would take like 3 seconds to start. And then it actually had a bug in it so that it would modify the data if there was anything afterwards. It would just kind of truncate it until it was read-only. And so just every kind of tool for just quick exploration didn't really work for that purpose. And I was really missing that really rapid, just show me the data and I just want to see it from my own eyes and then pop back out.
And then for the sake of you rewriting this tool from scratch, I'm curious if there was any functionality in the original tool that you either consciously left out because it didn't suit your particular needs at the time, or any functionality that you tried to replicate but weren't quite able to match because you didn't have the necessary context that you had at the time when you were working at F5.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I've been working on this tool now, Visidata, for a lot longer than I worked on the prototype that I had made. But because it was a networking company, one of the things that was in the original version that I still haven't added, and maybe someday I can add it, wouldn't be that big of a deal, but was the ability to add like a derivative column because it was live updated from actual data on the device. What you'd want to, you see like the bytes transferred, for instance, then you could add another column that would be the derivative of bytes transferred per second. And you could just kind of do that for any column you wanted to. And that was a super handy feature. But I'm finding that Visidata is used more for static data now than the original tool was at F5. And so that feature hasn't been added. I do remember that that prototype had pop-up like little, if you wanted to change a field between 10 values in enumeration, there was a little modal pop-up that would show up and you could scroll down and pick the right option. That was always kind of a neat little feature. It made things a little easier to use. Like right now, if you have to add an aggregator, you look at it on the bottom line for the list of them, which I still don't quite like. But I decided to not add modal dialogues to Visidata, that if you want to see something, you have to go to a fresh sheet if you're going to go to a fresh thing, or the modality is just on the bottom status line. That was a conscious design decision. It looks flashier to have the pop-ups, but as I'm doing more design work, I see that modal dialogues are just kind of get in the way,
You mentioned that the common use case for Visidata now is for static data. I'm wondering if it does have any capacity for being able to process continuously updating information, such as the top command in Linux or the network streams that you had built the original tool for.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things I would love for Visidata to have more of are adapters or plugins or loaders for other things like Top. Actually, Top's a great example. And I've got some prototypes of something for VGit. VGit's kind of still more static data. I do have a vping, which goes out and it's like a kind of a combination traceroute and ping. It just kind of live updates as it's finding the various hops and their latencies and stuff like that. But then it turns out that every one of these applications is a pile of work. And I've been devoting so much to the core application that I found myself not having a whole lot of time to polish the other ones to the degree that I want to. So I wish that I had that time, or I could find somebody that wanted to work on that with me. But I've been focusing on the other one, on the main one.
I'm curious what the main use cases are for Visidata that you have found both personally and within the community, and in particular, which tools it has replaced in your toolbox for things like systems administration or data analysis that you might reach for otherwise, but that Visidata is just more convenient to use.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like one of the main use cases is to get a first look at downloaded data. I know that Jeremy Singer-Vine, who is a data editor at BuzzFeed, uses it all the time for exactly this purpose, because you find data all the time online, it's public data, or even if it's not, and you don't know if it's useful even, and you don't want to spend a whole lot of time investing in porting it into a database, for instance, or getting it into some form. You just want to see right now, just show me like the columns and the first, however many rows, and then do a quick search or however you do, and to be able to get to that instantly as opposed to doing any amount of coding or work is one of the huge benefits of it. And so I would say that is the main thing that it's super useful for, exploratory tool. And then the other thing that I find it super useful for is basically just getting data from one format and structure into another format and structure. So, if you just need this one-off thing, it's like you've got this pile of data here, whether it's in an Excel spreadsheet or even just piped in from another command, and you want to remove those 4 columns and add this other computed column and just save that off and pass it off, you can get that done in like 30 seconds, whereas doing it in any other tool is going to take you at least minutes to get those tools put together and write the code or whatever you're going to do, and probably more like a half an hour. And so it's a lot of those one-off scripts that I think is replaced for me.
Yeah, there are definitely utilities both in the general user space libraries, particularly for Linux, but also in Python that can do direct conversion between formats. But the workflow you were describing of being able to manipulate the information before you commit it to the other format is definitely something that would typically require a lot more effort and exploration to make sure that you're getting things right. And then once you do get it working, you're likely to use it repeatedly, but it's going to be much more static and brittle than if you were to use Visidata in a more exploratory fashion. And I know that it also supports being able to build pipelines for that repeatable use case as well. So I'm wondering if you can just talk through an overall typical workflow for data exploration and analysis, and also the sort of conversion workflow that you might use Visidata with.
Yeah. Okay. So a typical workflow, for instance, I might like download some data from the internet, like for instance, data.boston.gov. Every city's got their own public data sets, right? And so you open it with VD, you poke around, see what's there. I like to see the scope of the data. and the precision, basically, how wide does it get and how much individual pieces do you get, how clean it is and how useful it is for my purposes. And then as I'm browsing around, I find that, oh, this column seems interesting. I wonder what's in here. And because there might be, a million rows in here, it's hard to see that. And often it's sorted by in a certain form. And so I do a frequency analysis very often. Shift F is, I think, one of my favorite things about it. And so, you just Shift F on any column, and within maybe instantly or at least a couple of seconds, you can see the top value in that column and the number of values in that column total. And I think it's really great for finding if there's any anomalies or outliers in the data. So you can kind of use it as a quick sanity check. And it's like, oh, I see, there's really no data in that field, or seldom is there data in that field, or that's interesting. Why are there half the fields completely empty, et cetera. So that's one workflow. And then what happens is once I find something that I've gotten into a state that I want it, then it's pretty easy to revisit the command log and cull it down to get only the stuff that I really want, and then save it off. And then I can do that repeatedly if it's something that the data might be updated, or I want to share that with somebody else. In fact, one of the things that's been interesting is how useful the command log has been for debugging. For when people say, this is what I've literally had to do or been doing with this, and this is the input data I have, and here's the command log that I've been running over it. And it's interesting how I will look at the command log and it's like, oh, I wouldn't have known that you did that exact command here or on that row, and that changes everything. That is the way that I can figure out what's going wrong in it. So it's been really useful as a debugging aid too, the replay.
I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about the command log, because as you said, it's definitely frequent that you might be running through an exploratory cycle and you finally get to a good state, but you don't necessarily remember all the steps that you've run through, and you may have deleted code or added new code, so you don't know exactly what the flow was, whereas by using a more keyboard-oriented tool, you can keep that history and see what the overall workflow was. So I'm curious if you can just discuss the command log and how it manifests in Visidata and some of the benefits and drawbacks that it might provide.
Yeah, so the command log is one of those. So as far as I'm concerned, Visidata is a grand experiment. Like I originally made it as just a browsing tool, like a CSV browser, as I used to call it. And then it turns out that it's very broad. It's a lot more broadly useful. Like it turns out that spreadsheets and tables are a very universal construct. And so I just kind of I was at the Recurse Center in early 2017. I was just playing around. I was like, I wonder if I can record all actions into a table itself. And I just did that. And it didn't work at first because I was recording all the motions and everything else. And I was like, oh, that's a mess. But then once I took those ones that didn't belong in the command log out, it actually works remarkably well. And I think it's actually super handy. It's not as good, obviously, as a Python script. Like you can only have one input field. Like it's kind of a rigid structure. But given the limited amount of data that's on the command log, it's remarkably flexible and powerful. I'm very surprised about that. There is one thing that I do wish that I could solve, and I'm sure that, I know it is solvable, but I haven't managed to solve it yet. And that's that the command log records every action that you take, including all the dead ends that you wind up finding yourself in. And so those are sometimes handy to have on there so you can see what you did and what you didn't want to keep around. But when you're getting to the end and you're like, I want to do this again, you want to cull all those dead ends out, right? And just get to the place that you currently are. And so to have some kind of graph or tree that would get you from where you currently are and only show the commands that you took to get there, that's what I would really want to add to it. And I just haven't gotten to that point yet.
And another thing that you mentioned and that I also noted in the documentation is the case where you have a file which might have millions of lines, which would typically be either difficult or impossible to open in a more traditional terminal-oriented editor, such as Vim or Emacs or the Less pager. And I'm curious what types of performance strategies and techniques you've used to be able to handle files like that, and particularly being able to manipulate them without just exploding your memory usage.
So one thing is that it actually does explode memory usage. It doesn't. I guess it doesn't explode as much as some other things, but in my mind, it actually does take up a lot of memory. But beyond that, though, the one thing that really, I think, there's a couple of things that matter here. One is that there's an async thread decorator that you can add to any function in Visidata. And that means that when you call that function, it just spawns a thread and goes off and does it asynchronously. And there's always one main interface thread that keeps active that is constantly updating with the status of that. And then within that thread, you can add a little progress meter, and those are pretty easy to do. But the main thing is because that is so easy to spawn additional threads, I do that all the time whenever I'm doing anything that might take a while. And I know that any kind of linear operation on data, because you might have millions of rows, might actually take a while. So I want to make that spin off its own thread. And that keeps me conscious of how much time things are taking, for one thing. But I want to say that I actually don't think Visidata is fast in itself. It's just responsive. And responsiveness matters more than speed, it turns out. I would rather spend 10 seconds seeing a progress meter update and making to the end than 5 minutes with no progress and not knowing how long it's going to take at all. The one is kind of soothing. I can take a break for 10 seconds. And the other one is very frustrating and makes me almost on edge. It's like, do I need to do something here in order to kill it or before it takes over my entire computer? And then the other thing that's I think that it is important is that tools like Excel or Vim, often they want to own the data. They want to import it into their own structure and format, and that's what causes the thing to really blow up, because now you've got, every cell has to be stored separately in its own custom thing. Whereas the key, I think, architecture thing that Visidata has that makes it so flexible is that it stores the rows natively. And so whatever I get from whatever Python library or whatever, that just becomes the row. Every item is just that object. And then columns are basically lenses into those rows. And so it basically is it's computing the cells every time. It doesn't grab the cells and put them in there. It just goes ahead and computes it whenever you want to see it. And it makes adding a column trivial. You can add a column in constant time. And that also means that saving, for instance, is comparatively slow, because it means it has to do the evaluation of all those columns for every single cell when it's saving. But it turns out you don't have to save everything. Usually, you're not actually looking at everything. You're only looking at the first 100 rows or these columns or whatever. So I feel like those between the threading and the rows as objects and columns as functions architecture, that's what really helps it stay focused on the user experience like that.
Can you dig a bit more into the architecture and implementation of Visidata itself and some of the ways that it has evolved since you first started working on it? And I know that you've also got an upcoming 2.0 release, so maybe talk a bit about some of the evolution that's coming there, and then any libraries or language features that you have leaned particularly heavy on and found most useful in your work.
So probably the biggest evolution is that when I first was doing it, it actually started out as a single file script. I kind of put everything into a single vd2e.py, and the idea was that it was a drop-in thing. You could kind of copy it over to a server over SSH, and then just start using it, and you wouldn't need anything but the base Python. And I licensed that as MIT, and then as I started adding more kind of modules or plugins, like internal plugins to it, I licensed those as GPL3. And I was trying to keep this like very clean separation, because the idea was that you could use then this vd2e, which was very similar to the thing I had at F5, for making all kinds of other apps. But then nobody really took me up on that, and it's kind of hard to use somebody's single file library like that unless it's a super tight little library. And so I kind of gave up on that, and am now heading more towards kind of a more plug-in platform architecture, where Visidata, the app, is the thing that hosts the individual plugins that you can add, and maybe there will be a plugin for it may even wind up having a vgit application that you can use, but it's kind of turning it on its head. As opposed to incorporating vd2e, some particular version of your thing, you're actually using the Visidata library. And so then beyond that, it's now just a bigger open source project. We got a whole packaging release cycle, and I'm working with Anya, who has been very instrumental in some of the packaging and testing and documentation stuff that we've been doing. And it's just kind of taken off and gained more traction in that sense. And you asked about the libraries that I liked and stuff. And I'm actually, one of the things that I wind up doing also to keep performance good is I take very few dependencies. I feel like layers is how things get messy. And so the fewer layers that you have, the better off it'll be if you can wind up coding everything in between there. So the libraries that I use, obviously curses is essential, but that's built into the Python standard library. And the Python standard library is really fantastic, and everything's included, which is a super bonus. But then also the PyPy ecosystem in general is so broad that any format that I come across, HDF5 or Excel or whatever, they have a library already for it. And it's a library that you can just use in Python, and like you write a page of code and you've got the stuff in there. And then all the loaders really are just importing those libraries and then just calling them and putting the rows of the return in there and having some columns around it. And it's a pretty simple concept. One thing you mentioned, you wanted to know other ways that I keep Visidata fast. I've been very focused on making sure that it starts up very quickly. Like I feel like if it gets to be a half second of startup time, it just gets in the way. It feels like a certain kind of friction. And so one thing that I do a lot of is lazy importing. So all these libraries, I have no idea how long they're going to take to load or start up themselves. And I know that there are some pretty heavy ones, even in Visidata, that Visidata uses sometimes. But I don't use those unless I need to. And so when you open up an Excel file, for instance, that's when it imports the XLS library. And if you don't ever load an Excel file, it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to spend that time doing that. So that's another one of those tricks. And before we move on, I wanted to mention the Python date util library is one of those. Like I don't take many dependencies, but that's one that I've been very happy to take because it parses any date format that you can throw at it. Like if it can be parsed, I feel like it will parse it. And so it's amazing. It's a best in class detection and date parsing tool. And also another feature that I have used a lot is Python decorators. I'm not sure. I think that's a pretty standard thing, but I use them as just a way of tagging functions. For instance, like I mentioned, the async thread decorator, taking a pretty advanced concept sometimes and just making it just the essence of it so that I don't have to think or work hard to have those concepts work for me.
Yeah, the decorator capabilities and the syntax that allow for it definitely makes it a lot easier to organize code and concepts when you can just drop it on top of a function definition without having to try and maybe incorporate it into the body of the function and remember what are the return types, what are the inputs. You just say it wraps this function and then it handles it. I don't have to think about it anymore. And you can just keep it all in like a utilities library, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. Although I will say that one of the things that I wish that decorators did support was to be able to put the function, like the def function name and signature on the same line as the decorator. And that's a minor point, but I use a lot of grep type tools and I would like to be able to know, oh, that function that I'm looking at is async thread, or I have a deprecated decorator now, and I might want to see that when I'm searching for functions, for instance.
Well, one tip there is that if you add the grep-b at 1, then it'll show you the line that you want as well as the line just before it.
Oh, that's a great tip. Yeah, thank you.
And another thing that it stands out with Visidata particularly is the fact that it is entirely terminal oriented, whereas a lot of data exploration tools will be more focused on a graphical interface or trying to embed into a Jupyter notebook for providing some sort of visualization. And I'm wondering what your motivation was for focusing so closely on the terminal interface and making it a command line client.
Yeah, I feel like the terminal is my home. Like I've been using a terminal since the 80s, and so I'm very comfortable in that environment with those kinds of restrictions. And I'm much more comfortable with a keyboard than a mouse. But then as I am getting older, it's becoming harder to just type verbosely. And so I wanted individual keystrokes to do things, and I couldn't figure out how to do that in, for instance, a Jupyter notebook. The other thing is that a terminal is actually a very universal, because it's so old and mature, let's say, it's a universal interface. Like any platform has an SSH client and a terminal. And the only other way that you can get that level of universality is with a web browser and, like, for instance, an Electron client. And that's way too heavy. So I feel like the choices between a terminal, which is very light, and Electron client, which is very heavy, the choice for me is obvious. Like I want it to be a very quick in and out thing. And I don't know how I would do the same kinds of things as quickly as you can in the web or even a native app if you have to reach for the mouse. You could do it with a given native app for sure, but then you have to make a native app for Mac, for Windows, for Linux, etc. And I just didn't want to do that. And so really, Visidata is only about 10,000 lines of code all told, which is actually quite a bit, but it's not that much when you compare it to comparable tools like OpenRefine or whatever like that. And I think testament to being on the command line. Like I can do kind of the minimum necessary to get the job done and don't have to worry about all the pixel widths and stuff. It's like, no, you choose your own font. You choose your own font size and ways you want to interact with the things. I'm just here I want to get out of the way, to be honest.
It also has the benefit that, as you were describing originally, of being able to just copy it over via SSH or now pip install it on a remote machine. You don't have to go through the hoops of trying to set up a way to have a graphical interface to that remote box. You can just copy it over and it broadens the reach and capabilities and use cases for the tool, where the only access you have is via a terminal, which, as you said, despite its age, is still a fairly common experience for people who are working in technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm working remotely now, and we do have screen sharing apps, but they don't always work that great, and you have to sometimes install some other plugin or whatever. And the app that I love most, I'm not sure to call it an app even. It's called Teammate. It's a Tmux wrapper, I guess, and you install it, and you type Teammate, and you get an instant shell into your own machine, and you just give somebody an SSH link and they can do that. And people are usually amazed. And it's like, well, between that and Visidata, now we have an instant data exploration platform that we can share, and just with a little bit of a chat client or whatever, that's it. And I find that to be so much more accessible than modern video chat things. Like even us at the start of our session here had technology difficulties. It's just the shell is very reliable by comparison, I think.
By the fact that you are targeting the terminal environment, what are some of the constraints that brings with it in terms of your capabilities that you can bring into Visidata? Yeah, and just some of the most challenging aspects of trying to build a user interface for data exploration and analysis within this environment that is so graphically constrained, particularly given the fact that you have incorporated some visualization capabilities and just some of the ways that manifests.
Yeah, I have to say that I've been pleasantly surprised that I haven't felt as constrained as I thought I would. Like once I discovered that I could use Braille characters, for instance, to do the graphing, it kind of just works. And it's not perfect, but if you want more perfect things, you should be using other tools. And in fact, that's one of the things I think that is important with Visidata is it's not meant to be a be all and end all. It's kind of a glue technology, right? It's an adapter. And so once you figure out what you want to do, then you should go to the fancier tool and do it right. But there's no reason to do everything super right from the get-go. You just want a quick glance at it. You asked about the most challenging aspects of building a terminal UI, and I have to say that the thing that's been most challenging for me is knowing that if Visidata were on the web, it would probably be worth a lot of money. And doing it in the terminal means that I've kind of eschewed that. Like no one really pays for terminal tools. I shouldn't say no one. They actually have several Patreon subscribers, and I'm really appreciative of them. But if you think about how VisiCalc back in the day was it was a fancy program that sold for hundreds of dollars. It's like I can't imagine doing that with Visidata, right? That's just not how the world works. Although if it was a native app, that might be actually what it was possible to sell it for instance. The other thing that is more challenging than you might think is you mentioned pip installing something, and that's really great for people who already have Python and already know about how to use pip. But if I want to get this into the hands, I actually think Visidata is a pretty reasonable tool to use for anybody who's willing to use the keyboard anyway. And yet it's trickier. I think installation is one of the trickier parts, right? Like if I wanted my partner to go and install it on her computer, I have to tell her to install this, click here, download this. And it's like people just want a single thing they can download, they can double click on and then go, right? And that's just not how the terminal world generally works. So I feel like installation is one of those weird things where it's a larger barrier to entry than it should be. And yet I can't find a super easy way around that. So that's just how it has to be.
I'm also wondering which terminal environments it supports, because Windows is generally one that's left out of the support matrix for a command line tool, but because of the fact that Python does have the curses interface built in, or if you were relying on the prompt toolkit library, I know that there is the possibility of being able to support the Windows command line. So I'm just curious what the overall support matrix is for Visidata.
Yeah, I started off doing it on Linux, because that's what I run, and then of course it turns out it works in a Mac terminal just fine. And I didn't have access even to a Windows machine, and so I was like, well, Windows isn't really supported. And then it just turned out that people were just running it under Windows subsystem, Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL, I think that's what it's called. And it just basically just worked there. And then somebody submitted a small patch, and it wasn't really that big, and it works, I think, even without WSL now on a more recent version of Windows. And so I actually have never used it on Windows, but I know we've got quite a few people, some Italian open data users like Andrea Boruso loves using it on Windows, and it works fine. So as far as I'm concerned, it works under Mac, Windows, and Linux, and seems to be fine in all of those. So that's what I wouldn't say that's what we support necessarily, but if it works, I'm not going to say we don't support it either, right?
Another peculiarity of building a command line oriented client is that it is heavily keyboard driven, as you mentioned, and that means that you need to create the set of key bindings that will do whatever it is that you want it to do. So I'm wondering how you've approached the overall design and selection of those key bindings to ensure that there is a set of internal consistencies and that the key bindings make semantic sense, but also so that you don't run out of key bindings in the event that you have some new capability that you want to run into, because it is a limited space even when you do incorporate modifier keys.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we're running up against that now. There are a few keys left in some sense, at least a few keys that people want to use. So the main thing is I have to use mnemonics to make sure that things stick in my own memory. I actually have a pretty bad memory myself. And so if they don't fit in my mental model, I can't remember them from one month to the next. So I've made sure that they at least make sense to me. And because I've been using terminal stuff for so long, I'm kind of like tuned into the existing text culture that is around. So a lot of the key bindings are borrowed from like Vim, of course, like, D for delete and A for add and stuff like that. Actually, when I showed it to a guy on ingy.net, he chastised me for that Control Z didn't suspend Visidata. And I was like, oh, you are totally right. That needs to be fixed right away. And I did fix it right away, because you want to make sure that the things that people who are using the text client are used to will still work. And so Control C will just work. And the other thing I think that's really important is there's like layers of mnemonics. So we have a couple of modifier keys, and I wanted to keep those very simple. Like I think that Vim is great, but it's kind of, it feels daunting when you see all the different possible combinations. And so I hope that when you see Visidata has exactly 2 prefix keys, that it's like, okay, maybe we can wrap our heads around this. And then those are just modifiers on existing other commands, right? And so there's kind of like layers. So another piece of this is that column for instance, are all on the symbol keys. And in fact, the types are all on a single row on my keyboard anyway, right? And so you've got the date is an at, and the converting it to an int is a number sign. Those are all just adjacent to each other on the top row of the keyboard. And then other column things are also symbols. And so you don't get confused thinking, well, is an int I or whatever? It's like, no, it's one of those ones up there. Which one is it? Oh, I think it might be the one that looks like that. That helps me anyway. And the fact that the sheets going to a new sheet are all on shift key. And, for me, it's like shift and sheet. I don't want to say rhyme, but something like that, right? And so shift F goes to the frequency sheet, stuff like that. And then finally is symmetry. I think that that's really important. So I reserved all of the pairs. So for instance, open paren, open brace, close brace, those were all reserved from the get-go for things that have both a front and a back. So sorting is the square brackets, and one way goes ascending, the other way goes descending. And scrolling down to the next item is a greater than sign versus the previous item is less than sign. And I feel like that symmetry on those things is very useful, but then also more largely symmetry between commands. So, the G prefix goes bigger and the Z prefix is more precise. And so when you're saying, I want to change all of these, I want to delete all the rows I've got selected, that's, GD. If I want to unselect all rows that are selected, that's GU. And like, it just kind of, to me, anyway, it feels like, well, that makes sense. Like you maybe not know it before you discover it, but once you discover it, then it's sticky. And I feel like that's a super important thing. So like the Visidata interface isn't made for the first time user, it's made for like the third time user.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of peculiarities and sort of culture and history built up around different key bindings. And as you mentioned, Vim has its own set. Emacs has a different set of key bindings that people will be familiar with. And then there are any number of command line tools that have created this sort of general pattern of how you would craft these key bindings. So it's definitely interesting to hear some of the history of how you have approached it because of your particular tool set choices. And like you said, anybody who's been living on the terminal long enough will find it fairly natural. And I appreciate the care that you've put into considering how you add new key bindings so that it doesn't just end up cluttered, and so that it so that you can have some sort of mnemonic muscle memory of being able to recreate a certain workflow once you pick it up, because with any tool, there will be periods where you put it down for a while and don't come back to it. And then when you do come back to it, you want to be able to just get right back to being productive without having to go back to try and remember what were all the key commands and look at the reference manual.
Yeah, totally. The other thing that we did was a year ago or so, we instituted long names. And so there's the key bindings, which are, as they are. And they originally that was all we had. It was just, Shift F means the frequency table. That's the only way you could access it. But now there's actually a long name for that. It's like, I think it's open frequency table. And I'm not sure if that's exactly right. Don't quote me on that. And then you bind the Shift F to that. And so people can rearrange their keyboard if they really want to. But also it gives us the ability to add commands that aren't bound to any key. And so, for instance, if you make your own command in your Visidata RC or whatever, you can make that and bind it yourself. Or if we provide a command that's very unused, like for instance, I think random rows that used to be on Shift R, but then we made Shift R be redo in the undo redo pair. I felt like that's kind of symmetry of Shift U and Shift R, as opposed to Vim's lowercase u Control R, which doesn't make any symmetric sense to me anyway. But anyway, so I moved the random off of Shift R, but then now there's no real good place for the random selection of rows to go. And I feel like selecting random rows is an infrequent enough operation that I put it on a long name, and then you can just press the space bar and enter in a long name. And when that long name is random rows, it goes ahead and does it. So I feel like that's another tactic, is to start moving things off of the default key bindings into more of like a huge list of possible commands that you could use.
Yeah, that's another thing that's got a long tradition, both in Vim and Emacs and other tools, of being able to have a way of opening a prompt that you can then start typing, as you said, a long named command, or being able to start typing it and then maybe tab through to cycle through what the commands are, so that you don't have to necessarily remember all of those off the top of your head as well.
Mm-hmm, totally. And we do have tab completion, and then and it works anywhere that we have an open prompt, including the long name thing.
And then in terms of the types of analysis that Visidata can do out of the box, I know that you mentioned frequency analysis or histograms, but I'm curious, what are some of the other capabilities that come natively in Visidata, and any of the interesting plugins that you or others have contributed for being able to expand the capabilities and utility of Visidata?
Yeah. So out of the box, it can do all kinds of interesting stuff, searching and filtering, bulk editing and cleaning, spot checking, finding outliers. I use it actually more often than I would think for file format conversion. The ability to load any format and then save it to JSON or character separated value or Markdown is super handy and gets me from here to there a lot faster than I could sometimes otherwise. Even scraping a web page for its tables is basically built in. Then Jeremy Singer-Vine, for instance, has written several plugins already for the current version. He wrote one that does a row deep duplication and an FEC, the Federal Election Commission dataset, a loader for those. And they just, you just download those and import them in your Visidata RC. They're ready for action right away.
And when I was looking at the documentation, it seems that one of the libraries that you can load into it is pandas, and I'm wondering if that means that you can expose all of the pandas capabilities as well as you're exploring these data sets, because I know that that's often the tool people will reach for their first time digging into a data set, just to see what's the shape of it. And so I'm curious how that works into the overall sort of use case of Visidata as the exploratory tool, and then where the boundaries are of when you might want to jump to pandas, or if you can just incorporate that whole flow together.
Yeah, that's interesting. I made a very simple adapter for pandas. It really was, maybe 20 lines of code at first, just because I wanted to use pandas supports a lot of different loaders too, and be able to use those and be able to browse those is super handy. But what's interesting is that pandas and Visidata don't actually play that well together. In order to do some of the things like sorting, for instance, Visidata grabs each value and sorts based on that, but you want to use pandas built-in sort function in order to do it more efficiently. And there's just no good way to do that automatically. You have to kind of write all the commands in a way that was compatible with pandas for pandas sheets. And that's totally doable, but it's a fair amount of work, and I haven't done it. And so somebody did make some modifications to make pandas more responsive in certain cases and make things work better. And that's totally doable. But like I said, it takes a fair amount of work and is not doesn't happen naturally like that. And so you can't just use pandas things like you'd think. You can use some of the functions that pandas has on pandas sheets and even on non-pandas sheets if they're standalone functions. But to use a pandas data frame just naturally like you would, you probably are better off using it in Jupyter by itself.
And then in terms of the overall growth and adoption of Visidata, it seems that there's a decent community that's grown up around it. And I'm wondering how you approach the project governance and sustainability as a solo developer, and how you are looking to grow the community and incorporate more people into the future of Visidata.
Yeah. Well, as you're saying, I'm a solo developer. I've got a little bit of help now. Like I said, Anya has been instrumental in making me at least not being so alone with some of the decisions and discussions and stuff like that. There's also a Pound Visidata channel on Freenode that several of us are hanging out in. And there's people talking about things. People ask questions and is it possible to do this, etc. Maybe you could add this kind of feature. I would prefer personally a chat system like that because I find myself doing a lot better with chat. I mean, I've been on chat for over 20 years now than I do with email. Email is a lot heavier, requires more intention and attention. And chat, I can just kind of like toss off an answer and it's just done. So I'm, of course, the decider on those things, but I have to be honest, it kind of feels like I'm discovering Visidata more than creating it at this point. Like it's like a chunk of marble to a sculptor. It kind of tells me what it wants to become. And some things I didn't even consider. And then I look at it, I'm like, oh, why didn't I think of that already? Like the row type down in the lower left corner where it shows you, whatever lines or columns or whatever the current data type is. For the longest time, almost 1.0, that just said rows. And I didn't know why I even put the text there if all I was going to do is say the same thing every time. And yet I felt strongly that it should be there. And then once I realized that that should just be the row type, I was like, oh, like I don't feel like that was my creation. That is just how it has to be. If that makes sense. And so that, and then you mentioned about project sustainability. And the thing is that my energy is my most precious resource, my energy ability to code. I have a day job, and so I come home at night and sometimes I just want to screw around with Visidata. And it's really hard to like summon the energy when I don't have like a very concrete use case or somebody that really cares about something. And so I have the most energy when somebody is around and is enthusiastic and they have like a sample data set and they're like, I just want to do this thing to it. And it's like, oh, right. And how could we do that? Is there like it's a kind of like a little puzzle, like you kind of put together, like, can I use existing commands to do this? Do I have to write like a one-liner that they can put in their Visidata RC? Or does this require like a different core piece of functionality so that now not just that case, but 10 other cases can be solved too? And those are the things I enjoy the most. And I actually do really enjoy solving those puzzles. But then sometimes we'll have people who ask for a generic feature and like, it doesn't feel like it's not very immediate. It's more abstract. Or I have a concept for something that I've been wanting for a while, and because there's nobody actually really who really wants it, I'm less motivated. I just kind of decide to do something else.
So, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or innovative ways that you've seen Visidata used?
I feel like we have a couple of super fans, people who like will use it for well more than they really should. And one of them is a guy named Christian Warden, and he does some a lot of Salesforce consulting and stuff. And so he's got just buckets of data and just wants to move through it quickly. And he built a duplicate row finder for some data set with Python expressions and VD script. And Visidata is not made for inter-row computation. Like you can have columns that compute within a row, no problem. But if you want to look at the previous row, it's not really meant for that. I mean, I would like to add that at some point, but I haven't figured out a really great way to do it yet. But he figured out how to pull it off, and it was an amazing beast. And it worked, and I was amazed. They actually exposed like a bug with computation so that it was taking forever to run. But once we fixed that, it actually was remarkable. It's like, wow, you really have turned this into yet another Turing-complete programming environment. So that has been kind of weird. And then also, I'm not sure if you or your listeners have seen the lightning talk that I gave a couple years ago, but I just kind of like, I had some data that had lat long coordinates, and I was just curious if I could plot those in my little canvas. And it turns out that plotting latitude, longitude as XY coordinates works really well for maps. And if you've got even like 1,000,000 points, there you go, and you can see the distribution of things. And it was surprising to me that it worked as well as it did, to be honest. Like I don't think Visidata is built for geographic information at all, and yet you can kind of pull it off. So that's been both surprising and unexpected, and kind of pleasing too.
Yeah, I did see that lightning talk, and that was one of the things that I was kind of blown away by as far as the visualization aspect of Visidata, given that it's a terminal environment. And so it's interesting to hear how you just mapped the lat long to XY coordinates, and I'm sure that you just figured out what were the maximum bounds of the coordinates that you had to figure out what were what the overall plane coordinates needed to be in relation to each other. So that's pretty funny.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing, one more thing, if you don't mind, that has been kind of surprising to me is how meta the thing goes. So editing Visidata's internals using Visidata's own commands is something that's been kind of surprising for me. Just yesterday, a user asked how they could get a type column on the describe sheet. And I thought about it and I was like, what you can do is you can go to the columns sheet and you can copy it from there and then you can paste it onto the columns sheet of the describe sheet and it'll just work. And it's like, you couldn't possibly do that with Excel, right? And similarly, if you've got 1,000 columns in whatever thing and you want to search or select all the ones that begin with a certain thing and remove all those from the set, you can do that in Visidata, and that's no problem. That just works just like anything else. And I have no idea how you would do that in almost any other tool. And so I feel like the metadata editing aspects of something has been surprising for me, even though I put it in there. But the fact that it works as well as it does has been really kind of interesting.
And looking forward, what are some of the features or improvements that you have planned for the future of Visidata?
Well, so right now we're working on the 2.0 release, which will be still a couple months out, and the goal is to stabilize it. And the current version, 1.5.2, is actually incredibly stable and really tight. Like we haven't found, well, there's been at least one bug I've seen, but that's fine. It's an edge case, but it's actually pretty stable. But the API is kind of all over the place. It doesn't really, it's not as coherent as the user interface. And so one of the things we want to do is make the API stable and produce some more coherent documentation about the internals. We're calling it the book of Visidata. And the point of that is so that we can let it rest and work on some other things, but then let other people go wild and share their own creations, plugins or commands or whatever, loaders, without destabilizing the core goodness that is there. So I'm sure there will be 2.1, whatever after that, but I'm really hoping that with 2.0, development can slow down and I can move on to some other projects that I have in the queue. Okay, so one of the things that we've been talking about that's kind of gotten a little bit of traction is something I've been calling where in the data is Carmen San Mateo, which is a throwback or it references an old game from the 80s and 90s, which maybe you've heard of, called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego?
I used to play it, yep.
Okay, yeah, so you're familiar. So the idea is that I want that kind of game, but with data and data sets. And so it's for hardcore data nerds. It's kind of like an escape the room game or a choose your own adventure kind of thing, where you're solving whatever crime, but you get the data sets to look at. And that's how you get the actual clues and solve the actual puzzles. And so I'd like to work on that. And that's my next project, probably. It's in the queue. But I don't really want to do that until we've got Visidata 2.0 locked down and feel like it's in a stable place for everybody.
Are there any other aspects of Visidata or data exploration or any of the other accompanying projects that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to close out, that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Not specifically, although I did want to say that I feel like we're in an age of kind of a terminal renaissance, that we went through the period in probably the late 90s and early 2000s where it was more graphics all the time, and you were kind of that was the obvious way up and out. And the terminal has been, with us throughout, and I definitely have never left it. But I feel like within the past maybe 10 years or so, with projects like Oh My ZSH and tmuck/teammate and many other ones, that the terminal has been kind of getting a resurgence. And even now, when people go to data science boot camps and stuff, they have to learn the terminal and get involved in there too, because you need to be able to do that kind of stuff in order to get anywhere, to dive deeply into data stuff. And so I feel like this is part of that. Visidata is saying, no, wait a second, you don't have to be in the web graphics world in order to be hyper-productive. In fact, not being in that world makes it a lot easier for you if you can just embrace the fact that you're going to be at the terminal and using a keyboard.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the fact that there is a lot more focus being paid to just making things that work in the command line and being able to stitch them together, because as you said, the graphical interfaces, well, they are appealing and it's easier to sell something to somebody who isn't as technical if you're in that environment. They do bring a lot of extra weight and requirement to the development and maintenance of them, as well as in some cases the use of them, because they are definitely much more mouse driven, and it makes it harder to be able to have just a unified flow.
Yeah, and to be honest, the versions of iOS and Windows are going to keep marching forward, and I have no doubt that if I made an app for the current version of either of those things, that in the next 3 or 4 years, it wouldn't work with the next version. And I am actually pretty confident that if I don't touch Visidata for the next 4 years, that you'll be able to use it in the next version of Python on whatever thing, no problem at all. And I find that to be really motivating to do a good job now, because I don't have to keep writing it. I'd have to do it good once.
For anybody who wants to follow along with the work that you're doing or get in touch, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'm going to move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose a newsletter that I actually found while I was doing some research for this conversation called Data is Plural, that's maintained by Jeremy Singer-Vine, who you mentioned a few times. It's a weekly newsletter with just different interesting data sets that looks to have some fairly curious discoveries. So if you're looking for something to experiment with Visidata, you might have some interesting finds in there. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Saul. Do you have any picks this week?
I wanted to promote Teammate, which I think I have during this episode already. So definitely give Teammate a look if you're a terminal user and want to have a multi-user experience. There are a lot of other tools in that same bin, like Mosh. I wanted to give a shout out to the mobile shell for less than perfect network connections. And yeah, there's all kinds of good tools out there, but I'm not sure I can come up with any more off the top of my head.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you've been doing with Visidata. It's definitely something that I'm going to be experimenting with, because I spend a fair amount of my time on the terminal and have to do a lot of exploration of random data sets, whether it's just CSVs or piping things from different bash commands. So thank you for all of your work on that tool, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great day too.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.